Hey guys, this is Samuel's Geek, and I wanted to give some suggestions for summer reading. These are some of the books I've read this year that I thought were particularly good, and that I would think maybe some of my fans here on YouTube would be interested in reading. So, a lot of these books are political or a little bit philosophical, so if you're not into that, I apologize. That's just the stuff I love to read. I'm mostly a nonfiction reader. I read exclusively on my Kindle when I get on the Washington, D.C. Metro back and forth. And, I also read on the bus sometimes here in Virginia. So I do a ton of reading just because there's not much to do on the bus or in the Metro. And as much as I love podcasts, sometimes I just get sick of hearing people talk. Anyway, here's some of the things I've read this year and I've reread this year that I think would be great additions to your library and to your summer reading lists. So the first one would be Suicide of the West by Jonah Goldberg. This book explores how populism came to rise in the United States and why it's popular, but also why liberal democratic capitalist countries are good and what makes them good, and the fact that we don't really understand that liberal democratic democracies aren't really natural. We have to maintain them, and if we don't maintain them, we revert back to a natural state and a natural sort of form of tribalism, such as populism, and how that's starting to happen in the United States and how it can change. So, if you're interested in the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and why they have become such towering figures in politics, in what seems like just like a year, they became huge. If you want to know why, and you want to know ways to stop it, or why things are kind of happening the way they are, it's a really good book. It's way better than a lot of the other books I've seen suggested trying to explain the Trump phenomena. That aren't, blatant, pro-Trump pieces or anti-Trump pieces. This takes a fairly neutral stance on Trump, but it is a conservative point of view. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend reading it. The next one would be The Responsive Chord. The Responsive Chord is an old book by Tony Schwartz, who made some iconic commercials. One of the most iconic that most people remember would be the commercial against Barry Goldwater, the Daisy commercial. It shows a little girl counting, petals off a daisy, and then a giant nuclear bomb in the background. It doesn't say a word, but it implied it in everyone's mind that Barry Goldwater was crazy, and that's why you shouldn't vote for him. But he is a mastermind of media, and in this book, he breaks down how to communicate effectively in all forms of media, why it's effective, and if you're into anything like marketing or politics or even philosophy, this book will teach you how a lot of the marketing works. And it's a little older, so it talks about radio and television, but if you just pretend and modify that for modern day mediums such as YouTube or podcasts, it still works. It's brilliant. This guy was decades ahead of his time and obviously a giant in the industry. So if you're interested in any sort of marketing, business, politics, you got to pick up The Responsive Chord by Tony Schwartz. The next one is In Praise of Public Life by Senator Joe Lieberman. This is to help a lot of people get some positivity back in politics. Now, I know the last couple of years have just been hectic and super negative, and it makes people really cynical. But this book will remind you of a better time in politics where people were very optimistic. Ironically enough, they talk about how polarizing it was. Poor Senator Lieberman had no idea how polarizing it was going to get. But in this book, it recounts the rise of politician Joe Lieberman, who was, in case to refresh some people who don't know, he was a senator from Connecticut. He was the Democratic nominee for vice president in 2000. He was famously the Democratic senator who changed into an independent, and people didn't like him for that, and he endorsed John McCain, and people didn't like him for that on the left-wing side either. But he's a fairly independent guy, always has been, and he gave some interesting reasons by why he got into public life and why he thinks other people who are just average people should consider running for office or consider serving on a board or consider public service. And he makes the argument of why having, being in public service is good. And a lot of us need reminders of that because a lot of us feel down and out about our politicians. And if you want that to change, you should run for office. And if you're interested in what running for office kind of looks like, this is the book to pick up. The next one is The Outsider by Albert Camus. This is a great book on philosophy from Albert Camus. I love it. It's so hard to describe, though, but it basically deals with the tides and turns of being a young man, of breaking out of the cynical, quarter-life crisis. It's just like an embodiment of it, and it kind of makes you reflect. I don't know why I act like it's such a great book, but it reminds me a lot of myself. Like when I was feeling down, when I first started YouTube, actually, when I was about graduating high school, not starting YouTube, like in the middle of my YouTube career, kind of my peak. So 2010-ish, I was feeling very similar feelings to the main character in The Outsider. I was very down on society. I was very angry and very pessimistic and cynical and didn't care. Reading this book will help people in that state of mind because it will remind you how ridiculous you are and how you're not thinking rationally and how it can get you in huge trouble. So if you're down and out and you need some humbling, The Outsider is a great book. And then finally, Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Lots of you have probably read this before or seen the movie. It is a classic, and I think it's very prevalent to our times because of all the tribalism. It shows just how normal, everyday people can turn into incredibly angry, irrational people just because they've been separated from rational thought. It kind of goes back to Suicide of the West. Suicide of the West talks about this in modern terms, but if you need more symbolism, Lord of the Flies is a good complement to that book. Because Lord of the Flies shows how kids, just normal kids, can break down and turn against each other just because of tribalism, just because of weird situations that can happen. And it's a good analogy for our political time right now, where you can see normal, everyday people support and defend and say irrational things just because of the heat of the political moment. So it's a great book. In fact, I think Suicide of the West, Outsider, and Lord of the Flies are perfect readings on this current, hectic, angry time that we live in, and it can help us gain perspective. So those three books in particular, great stuff. And if you need some more positivity in praise of public life to remind you on good reasons to run for office and good reasons to get involved in politics, and if you want a good way to market your campaign so that you're prepared for politics, the Responsive Chord shows you all the ways that you could make the best ads possible. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you check out some of the books. Samuel out.